Welcome to the Fiscally Awesome podcast. I'm your host, Matt Gardner, co-founder and CEO of Hiline. Excited to kick off our very first episode with Maxine Minter. Maxine is a multi-time founder. She's doing awesome things in the world. Most notably, she heads Australia's first venture fund led by a solo female GP. It's actually the country's first dedicated pre-seed fund. The fund is called CoVentures. We got a lot of cool stuff to cover today, so I'm excited to get right into it. All right, Maxine, thank you so much for being the very first guest on the podcast. You're probably one of a few people in my professional career that's had like crazy influence over my development as a CEO, as a founder. In our conversations, you mentioned something about accounting often being used by founders is a handbrake. And I thought that was like such an interesting metaphor. Can you elaborate on what you meant by that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think my observation, both my experience and my observation, is that being a founder and then watching a bunch of founders and partnering with a bunch of founders as they operate their businesses, so few of us and them use finances strategically. Most folks think of it anywhere on the continuum between like compliance that I just have to do, and it is a handbrake on my development. It's a handbrake on my kind of trajectory, through to something that feels big, scary, unknown, unapproachable, and or like monopoly money, right? Depending on your funding journey.
Yep.
And I think leaving finances and financial strategy anywhere in that continuum, from like compliance to undiscovered country where all of the money feels fake, just leaves so much to be desired and really hampers the development of those founders in their long-term journey. Because at the end of the day, we as operators are investors. We're investing company capital, human capital, our own focused attention to drive return on that investment for ourselves, for our team, for the ecosystem that we serve, for the investors in our company. And if we fail to think of it in that way, that doesn't actually change the nature of what we're doing. We're just probably making bad decisions. And so I think the kind of financial piece and coming to the realization that financial skills and getting the right financial support around you on that end of the continuum is crucial, because it drives a lot of the value that you are able to create in the rest of your business. So it makes me really sad when I see people just ignore it.
What you're talking about is like teaching capital allocation skills and starting to get founders to think about, you have a responsibility to your shareholders once you take on an investment to try to maximize shareholder return. Basically every decision you make as a founder should orient back to that in some way, shape, or form. Whether you're investing in building technology, hiring people, like there should be some inherent thought to, there's going to be some return that I'm going to earn on this investment decision. So do you think folks think about it that way? Or is it learned over time?
Yeah, definitely not. I mean, sorry, that's too categorical. In the vast majority of circumstances, no, right? If you happen to come from a financial background or an investing background, obviously that's different. If you happen to, say, grow up in a family of entrepreneurs, that's often different, right? A deep understanding of capital as the lifeblood of a company. And if you don't understand the way that it flows and how to keep it circulating and all of those things and how to use it strategically, then most companies will die over an extended period of time or a very short period of time. But absolutely, in the vast majority of, especially first-time, sometimes even second-time founders, folks just haven't spent the time developing that skill set yet. And it can be a journey to, first of all, kind of help them understand how valuable it is as a skill set. And then second of all, to actually start that ramp of learning. Let's say you are a subject matter expertise or a subject matter expert founder, or you are a technical founder. Mostly, you haven't really had to engage on the complex financial machinations of a business or thinking about capital allocation. Actually, I have been, side note, totally blown away by the number of people who don't think of themselves as investors, who have things like pensions, who have things like retirement accounts, right? Who have things like equity in a business, right? They have ESOP. And if you ask them to say, hey, do you think of yourself as an investor? They're like, no, I've never invested anything in my life. Well, that's not true. Let me point to this. In some circumstance, 5-6 figure balance, sometimes in equity, 7-figure balance, and you've made a single through to a collection of investments in these categories. And so I think actually the vast majority of us are already investors. It's a question of whether you're making good investment decisions because you are starting to think about it as an investor. So what I notice is, at that very early stage of building a company, it's worthwhile to start to think about financial allocation and start to exercise the muscle as an allocator. Actually, I find the most useful and pragmatic entry point for that at the early stage of building isn't things like thinking about yield on the venture round you just got. Yes, I think it would be great if you did that. It probably will generate a lot more value for you in the long term than just leaving it in a cash account. But even thinking about, for example, your focused attention, right? A key resource of the business, thinking about where you're investing it and what you're getting back from it on what kind of timeline. Thinking about your team's attention, asking yourself the same question. Where am I investing their time? Where am I asking them to allocate their time? What, as an organization, are we getting back from it over what kind of timeline? Right? And at the very early stages of building your business, whether you're venture-backed or whether you are bootstrapped, there is a degree to which you are trying to find product market fit. You need to find product market fit on some kind of short time horizon to either have enough profits to continue to exist if you're bootstrapped, or to convince the next round of investors that they should invest again if you're venture-backed. And so thinking about the kind of short-term payback of your focused attention and that of your team, I think is really valuable. I find that to be a really useful jumping off point to start thinking about, okay, what are my pools of resources? Money being one of them, focused attention being one of them, my team's attention being one of them.
Yep.
And then thinking about investments of those buckets of resources and what the ROI is. Then it's actually a really easy jumping off point if you really internalize that thinking to apply that to your financial function. And the reality is that no one, as you're operating a business today, needs to be expert when it comes to accounting, needs to be expert when it comes to financial modeling, all of those things. And I think that, for professional services firms like you guys, it's really helpful to have that expertise so that bit's just covered. That's not the strategic bit. The strategic bit is working out, okay, what does this mean then? And how should I be using this information to make long-term, short-term strategic trade-offs and decisions? And I find that's a really helpful progression. I think the other thing to internalize as a founder is that you are stepping onto one of the most aggressive learning journeys you could possibly choose. And growth hurts. And it doesn't always come all at once. And so I think we can all agree that by the time you are at millions of dollars in top line revenue, teams of hundreds of people, you need to have sufficient strategic understanding that either you can manage the financial reality of your business or you can manage someone who manages the financial reality of your business. Those are your options. And if by the time you get to that point, that is the first time you start to think, by some grace of God, you get to that point without ever having thought of finances up to that point, the probability that you are capable through to expert at that stage is really low. So actually starting to think about these things at your very earliest stage gives you the opportunity to actually grow into the boots that you're going to have to be standing in at that stage anyway. And I think collectively as an ecosystem, we learned this in a very painful way of 2019, 2020, 2021, that there is a moment at which you then have to step into those boots and everyone will be shocked and horrified if it's the first time you've ever thought of cash flow at the point that you're starting to earn millions of dollars.
Yep. As you know, we started the business as a bootstrapped operator. And I was forced, even without probably knowing what I was doing at first, like you have to learn how to allocate just not only financial capital, but human capital to make sure that you're focusing your team in the right direction, pointing them in the right direction all the time. But I do want to bring us back to the role of AI in finance. Like, where are we going? And this is probably, we're going to nerd out a little bit, but would love to see, what are your thoughts? Like, where do you see the finance and accounting world going as AI becomes more common? And what's the role of humans versus role of technology in the future?
I think it is a fairly consensus perspective that in the very short through to medium term, a lot of the kind of accounting piece, like the actual allocation of numbers to the right categories, splitting of
You
transactions.
can apply this principle to like services in general if you want. That's like easier applying on like where is it going to impact
100%.
services versus accounting and finance. We can do that too. I can apply it on accounting and finance for fun.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, like seems obvious to me that a lot of that kind of like low level transactional stuff in finance, but also like in legal and in consulting, and a lot of that kind of like data movement, the data analysis, the content analysis will all be automated away to the extent that it isn't already. I think the reality, both you and I kind of grew up in inverted commas in professional services. I was a lawyer, you were an accountant. Like we lived what it felt like to be on the bottom rungs of those professional services
Brutal.
firms. And I think we should
Brutal.
brutal. And I think we can all agree that was not value add work. Cannon fodder, I think it was what it was colloquially called at the time, right? I was there copying and pasting. For some of the partners that I worked for, I was actually typing out the things that they would handwrite. If I was their client paying probably $450 to $750 an hour, knowing that someone was typing the thing that someone was handwriting, I'd be not so happy. But hey, that's how their business models work. So I think, there is an enormous amount of just kind of data wrangling or information movement that has to happen to get to a position where a very clever person can look at insights and make a strategic call. Actually, I think it's something to name here in the delivery of professional services. I think it's really relevant for AI. So in professional services, there's 3 buckets of value you can, in theory, deliver to your customer. And as time and technology has developed, most of this has been commodified. But take us back to the early 90s when professional services were in their heyday, right? You had like big international firms moving around the world, first consolidating within major cities, and then consolidating in countries, and then consolidating internationally, right? Partners making millions of dollars. To be honest with you, when most of our parents saw that folks were making bank and made suggestions to all of us that we go and study these programs at universities.
That's why I'm an accountant. That's what my dad told me. He's like,
right?
You should go do that thing. Like you can make bank. You'll be good at it.
Exactly. Right. So when that was happening, they were selling 3 buckets. They were selling information, they were selling insight, and they were, but sometimes not really, selling strategy. Right? The information they were selling in the legal world was, this is what the law is. Just finding the law was impossible because they were in these extremely dusty old books. Or in accounting, right, finding the data to know how much profit you happen to make that month. That was an enormous amount of human labor. So that's what they sold. And they made a lot of money on that. And then the insights, after folks like you and I were shot out of the cannon doing enormous amount of this grunt work, and they had the information in front of them, then high-paid partners at thousands of dollars an hour would look at that information and come to a view and deliver that insight. For the very, very highest paid, most expensive people, they would then take that insight and apply a strategy on top of it. And that's what they sold. Now, the internet happened, Google happened, cloud computing happened, and now we definitely don't sell information. No one is charging anyone to give them access to, other than say Xero, right? Or, Reuters. No one is really charging to give access to the information. They're not really charging to give access to the insight because with the kind of era of data analytics and big data, you can actually pull out much more valuable insight than most lawyers or accountants can actually pull out. And so now they're largely selling strategy. Increasingly, they're selling strategy. I think with the advent of AI, it's going to move that, and hot take is it's going to move that value creation all the way up just to strategy. AI, I think, will completely eat the insight, completely eat the information stage of that value creation. And I also think it will start to scale, if not eat, some of the strategy creation. So what does that mean then as an industry? I think from the founder side, you will start to get really high quality strategy from your providers. But I think you don't necessarily, and most of the folks that I have spoken to so far, don't necessarily want to interact with a non-human for their most sensitive, most strategic, most nuanced thing. They don't trust it. Rightfully so. You can imagine if you are, for example, moving your company from one country to another, or you're going through an M&A, would you really feel comfortable to just step into a chat with an AI and ask them, hey, can I make sure I'm on the right side of the law here? And it just say, yep, no worries, here's the law. I'm not sure that you would feel 100% comfortable. So I think right now
Too high
and for the
stakes.
foreseeable future,
Yeah.
it's too high stakes. Yeah.
Yep.
So for the foreseeable future, you want someone to engage with, to understand the nuance. So much of accounting and so much of law and so much of so many professional services and strategy, it's not black and white. It's not the answer is yes or no. It's, well, it depends on this, it depends on how you put the information together in this way, etc. So I think we're a long way from removing the human out of the system. If anything, I think the really exciting future vision of this is actually having really wonderful, highly strategic, excellent thought partners scaled with AI, scaled with the automation underneath, so that you, the founder and the provider, can actually focus on like the fun and interesting stuff.
Yep. I have this theory that you can, for software is all about building something and then you benefit, the users benefit from the value share of the technology that you built. In professional services or accounting, I think we can build like this central brain unit that's very similar with like systems, and you have technology and AI, and you can build something that you can then share the value of this thing that you've built out with your customers and your clients, and you can do it at like a really interesting value proposition. And I think you can actually start to create like 10x employees out of everybody that works with you if you build systems around them to empower them to do their jobs the right way. You can probably start to attract more dynamic people into professional services because they can actually see a clear path to being able to do the strategic work, the high value work, and the stuff that gives them more fulfillment. Like your story about how did you start? My first 3 months was like this transition from we had all this paper to like, then we stored it in the cloud. I spent months just scanning documents into the cloud. Like I literally went in and I would just go in the copy room and I would just rip through boxes and boxes of paper and scan them. It was brutal. I was like, what am I doing?
I know. I actually had a moment the other day where I was talking to someone about those early years of practicing, and it occurred to me, which made me feel so old, it occurred to me that most people practicing today, especially the younger generations, they think of data room as only a thing online. And they have no understanding of why we call it a data room. And what's embarrassing for me is when I entered the law, we still had physical data rooms. The reason they are called data rooms is they used to be a room, like a physical room, with all of your binders of materials. And access to your data room, in inverted commas, was someone giving you a key to a physical room and stepping into that room and going through your compactors and working your way through it. Yeah. I told someone this, a Gen Z person, this the other day, and they were like, no way. I had no idea this was ever a thing. And I was like, your shock and horror makes me feel incredibly old.
Yeah, like you used to have to go to first of all, I had to request a key to go in there. Then you had to go in there and try to find what you were looking for. And like most of the, if you're a founder who's in the early 20s, you probably have never known a world other than like a Notion where you can just query for whatever you want. Like you don't have to actually go look for anything. So it's like crazy how much I have seen in my life, which has not been very long, but it's changing pretty rapidly. But I loved your like 3 buckets of value that professional services provide to their clients, consumers. I think that's a really interesting way to think about it. Do you think the technology advances enough where it can reason and it can make educated hypotheses and make recommendations that aren't just based on like regurgitation of all the data that it has access to?
Ooh, in our lifetimes, yes, I think that will happen. In our professional careers, making some assumptions about when we might want to stop working like this, I don't know, that I'm like less sure about. Although, if I was a betting woman, I would say yes, probably. Right? I think there's a very real possibility that by the time that we are of retirement age, right, Gen Z will no longer be the dominant employees. It will then be Gen Alpha behind them. I think with the current pace of innovation in this space and making, if we're using previous experience as a predictor of future experience, it seems to be accelerating. So the kind of pace at which we have these huge material innovations and technological advancements also probably is going to accelerate. So if all of those assumptions prove to be true, yes, probably. And to be honest, I think it would be a much more pleasant user experience, right? If I could just like real-time query an incredible expert. Like if I think about some of those minds that I got the enormous privilege of getting to work alongside, who were deeply expert from information all the way through to strategy. And I was thinking about, if I was going to be making some of the most high leverage, most important decisions, and having that person in my corner, like incredible, really incredible to have their insights and knowledge and strategy available to me. And so could you build that into an AI? In theory, yes. But I think so much more has to happen around it for us as consumers to want to use that. For example, so much of engaging with an accounting, like a large accounting firm, an accounting service provider, and a big law firm and a big strategy is about the plausible deniability, right? The liability that comes with their professional services indemnity.
Yep.
And or for you to be able to say, well, they told me to, so I did it. So I think we need to build AIs and firms around AIs that are have that level of trust, or the current trust holders are able to absorb that. But I think that it is possible, and I'm excited about that. But I think the progression to it is more interesting for me. Do you think we'll get there?
I think it's a new version of a business, right? I don't think that becomes like one thing that everybody goes to get like this one thing done. I think that businesses,
100%.
it becomes a new business, like a new version of a firm. I don't think you'll see 40,000, like in our space, outsourced financial operations, there's 40,000 firms. It's fragmented, it's hyper localized generally. I don't think that exists, but I do think that you will find there will be some very large companies who have built around AI, and they've taught their people. They probably don't need nearly as many people, but they've taught their people how to work really well with the technology to give the best experience. Like, it's about the experience of the user. So that will evolve in such an interesting way that it's like almost impossible to anticipate what it looks like, but it is going to look very different probably in 50 years.
100%. I think that's a really interesting thought experiment, and one that is a bit of a mind bender, but I think is worthwhile doing.
Ooh, I like mind benders.
Thinking about, so if we accept for a moment to kind of look back into history and say, okay, the invention of electricity, what the invention of electricity allowed for was a fundamental change in the value creation chain. So you could, let's say for a factory, prior to electricity, when steam was the majority driver of power, you would have to produce your factories as a tall building because it was around a tall steel cylinder. And all of your conveyor belts had to come off a central pillar. So they were like long, tall buildings, hard to construct, really expensive. And your value chain construction could only be so short because steam dissipates power as it gets further from the core. And so that was a constant, and then folks were innovating on how do we maximize, pushing steam out to the end of our conveyor belts and all of those things. And in comes electricity, but you don't need this really expensive building to be built anymore. You don't need this multi-story building. You don't need that core. You start to be able to have these long conveyor belts that you can produce and production lines that you can produce in a single-story building that goes for a really long time. So it starts to be able to be possible to create completely different ways of delivering the same product, right? At the end of the day, the thing that's popping out of that factory is still a dress. But how many people and how much it costs to put that together changed materially when we created electricity. So with AI, let's hypothetically say that currently the most bullish predictions are we create a Gen AI and we completely commodify the ability to develop everything from the kind of accounting compliance piece all the way through to the most strategic insight, or in the legal circumstance, everything from like legal advice all the way through to legal strategy. Right? If that part of the production is completely commodified, we still have to comply with laws.
Yep.
Right? We still have to protect ourselves. We still want to know what's going on. We still have to make hard decisions when it comes to financial allocation or, use of capital or those kinds of things. But if the inputs into those decisions become commodified, I find myself noodling on, okay, cool, then what does the future of the professional services delivery look like? What does the future of that value look like?
Yeah, it's broad. It's probably broader, right? Like it's got to be much broader than it is today. And you should be able to get a lot of what you need in terms of like back office and probably middle office operations from like singular sources. I think about this stuff frequently, but most of the industry, like they're like even like Intuit and QuickBooks, like they're still like trying to get people off QuickBooks desktop to move to QuickBooks Online because I don't think it's safe. I don't think my data is secure. Like I feel better if it's on my computer. So I look at where, and legal's probably not that dissimilar in a lot of ways, but
Oh, it's right.
they're like 30 years behind the adoption curve already. And we're already like in this moment where I'm thinking about like, how are we going to build a company around AI to get the best value and experience for our clients? So it'll be interesting to see how that affects the 40,000 companies that are out there doing it the way they've always done it. Um, so yeah, I think this is like the stuff I think about when I'm like laying in bed and I can't sleep. I'm just like trying to anticipate. Like it's like my crystal ball moment. Like what is going to happen in the future? Okay, that was cool. That was really interesting. So if we can maybe shift a little bit now, we talk about like all this change, right? So it's not just finance and accounting; it's also building software and AI. Like everything is changing, and I feel grateful for one to be building a business right now with all these technology advancements, like right in the middle of it. Rest of the industry is like not there, right? So I feel like I have this built-in advantage. So like starting to build a company, you're working with a lot of like very early stage companies building technology right now. So what is the mindset of the modern day founder? Like you're just getting started, you're trying to build like what makes their mindset different and their experience different? Like they just grown up knowing to do it this way. Like you could build software with probably a lot less engineers and capital than you could before. What's your perception of that?
Yeah, as a founder stepping into this journey in any point in history, but particularly now, like you are stepping into a extremely complex, extremely dynamic system. And so the mindset of being excited to grow, I think is so valuable and deeply believing that you can grow. Of what Angela Dweck would call the growth mindset, like this
Yeah.
deep belief that with enough time and effort on target, you can be good at anything. I think it is so important. I also think honing the skill to learn, a love of learning, but also being good at learning, also super important, right? Like in the last year and a half, these fundamental premises of what is required to scale a huge business have completely changed, right? I think about Chronicle. You mentioned they're kind of in the coding space. In Chronicle, I believe they've got 17 people and hundreds of millions
It's
in
wild.
revenue.
Wild.
17 and
Yeah.
an
That's
army of agents, but like 17 humans. If you said to me like 19 months ago, it's possible to scale a company like this, I would have said the closest that I have seen do this well is Telegram. And I think they've got like hundreds of people and, you know, hundreds of millions in revenue. And that was a wow factor at the time.
that's lean. That's still lean. That's also
That's
very
still
wild.
really lean. So it's
Yeah.
gone down by an order of magnitude. And that's happening everything from the way that you build your product through to the way that you find your customers, through the way to you actually operating your business. So kind of everything's up for grabs now. All of these core assumptions, these playbooks, they're all shifting at once. And so I think fostering the anti-fragility in you, fostering the growth mindset, fostering your ability to be dynamic, flexible in your thinking, but
Mhm.
convicted in your principles. All of these things I think are really valuable and so hard to do while you're trying to
Mhm.
make decisions and develop yourself in a fast moving environment. I will say, I feel like this is one of the things that popped out in one of our first conversations and why it has been such a pleasure to work alongside you with my executive coaching hat on, which is
Yeah,
just the pace of
your
learning,
coaching
right?
your coaching colors are now showing.
Right. The dynamism, I mean, I think that you show, think about that learning curve that you have to go on. And I think for anyone listening to this, like recognizing that learning curve and having some draw to that learning curve, I think is really valuable. I think the example I constantly use is, you know, very few people would say that it is physically comfortable to do, say, a hard workout. But so
Mhm.
many of us love that feeling of stretching and growing and grunting and sweating. And it's intellectually a similar thing, right? Being prepared to do hard things and making friends with that exhaustion and exertion, making friends with that level of effort, I think is a really valuable thing to do. And I think specifically in this moment, cultivating a comfort with some of your core assumptions changing and the fear and uncertainty and imposter syndrome that pops up when you go all in with a particular thesis and then one of your core variables gets changed.
Yes. Yeah, you almost I like to think about growth mindset. That's one of our, like, foundational principles. It's part of our culture, like, you have to have it. I like to think about it as, like, you have to be willing to just break your brain. Like, you have to be
Mm,
willing to fly close to the
beautiful.
sun, especially if you're a founder and operator. If you want to play it safe, if you don't want to break your brain, if you just want to do it the way it's always been done, we're in a world of technology advancement where that's just not going to cut it. Like that the world is going to pass you by, and there will be a moment where you will pay for that. That you have to be out in front. So I think, yeah, like to be a founder today, like that, I think that is even more true because nothing's staying constant. I mean, every 6 months, I just think like there's a new piece of tech, there's AI is advanced. Like, you just have to be thinking about your entire business end to end. How do I need to reconstruct it to move forward? And do I have all the right people given all this technology advancement to do it? So in terms of like founders, right? So I think it's you know, Highline serves like the broader like SMB ecosystem, right? Like, we have clients who are in early stage venture tech. We have clients who are bootstrap agencies, software development studios. We have nonprofits. And I just think that it's like, regardless of whether or not you're a traditional small business and you work in your community, or you have a US sales presence, or you have a capital partner, the characteristics of a successful versus unsuccessful founder, I don't think they don't deviate. Like, they're the same thing. So, in the work that you do is both a provider of capital and also an executive coach. What are like some of the key strengths and potentially strengths of successful, and then maybe weaknesses of some of the founders you've seen struggle over time?
The first thing I would say is that I don't think that there is one kind of persona or prototype here that is successful and one that is not successful. I
Mm,
think the like a really cool thing about building businesses is a recognition that humans and the businesses that they build and the markets that they operate in are ecosystems. So similar to, ecologies, if you picked up a certain kind of finch from the Galapagos and you plopped him into the Bay Area,
mhm,
right, he might not find a single thing to eat and die pretty quickly, even though he and all of his mates were just absolutely thriving in the Galapagos. Similarly, if I picked up I'm from Australia, where the sun is really hot and we have a hole in the ozone layer. And frequently, you will see when you pick up a foreign tourist and plop them into Australia, day two, they end up getting burnt top to tail, blisters. They do
yeah,
not thrive in that environment and they have to adapt. And so I think founders are the same, right? It really depends on the company that they're building, in the market that they're building in the kind of geography that they're building in.
mm,
In some markets, in some geographies, your family and your network is everything. Without those two things, you can't get started.
mhm,
In the US, it's less relevant, right? It's how deep are you expert in the area? How
mm,
much hustle do you have? How much comfort do you have in pushing your boundaries? So much ink has been spilled, especially in universities, on the archetype of the founder. What are they and what are they not? And I think entrepreneurship can look like so many different ways. Some things that I found to be really helpful if you plan to build your own thing from scratch. So you're not like innovating within a larger group or in a corporate group, right? You are not building a new product line within an organization, but if you're building a net new thing,
yep,
I think bravery as a core skill is so important, right? And let me be specific here. Bravery is the activity of knowing the risks, knowing how much work you're going to have to do, how much could be on the line if you don't get it right, and doing it anyway. Especially in this moment, I think that this is a particularly crucial skill because it doesn't work to be in a moment of change and dynamism and stand on the sidelines and wait for it to be certain. That's not going to happen. And so being brave enough to step off the sidelines, have a point of view, develop a thesis, throw everything you have behind it, knowing full well that that may not be true. So I think bravery here is a skill set I think is a really valuable thing to cultivate. The second is being a learning machine. And there's lots of research to show that being able to learn well isn't just about kind of core intellectual horsepower. I think we all collectively learned that lesson when we watched the smartest person in our class do really badly on their SATs or really badly at university because they didn't put effort in, or they didn't study, or they didn't, play the game or apply the right strategy. So like core intellectual horsepower may be helpful, but statistically doesn't show to be determinative of success. What we're talking about is the ability to exert long-term effort behind a goal, absorb information, kind of try to learn it as fast as possible, structure that information so that you can do what we call learning scaffolds, so anchor in new information to existing information, etc.
Mhm.
So for anyone listening to this who
Familiar framework. I've heard you use that one
yeah,
before a few times.
had that a couple of times. So I think, if you're listening to this and you're thinking about, hey, I don't actually think hand on heart I'm a very good inverted commas learner. I cannot recommend enough investing in that as a meta skill on how to learn really well, how to work through large volumes of information, how to learn information really well. The last skill I find to be really helpful is the growth mindset. And we've mentioned this already a couple of times, like this
Mhm.
deep belief that with enough time and effort on target, you can be good at something. That doesn't mean you need to be good at everything. I think it's really valuable to identify these are the things that I'm good at currently and that I want to continue to be good at. And these are the things that I'm not going to invest in. But deeply believing that you can, with enough time and effort on target, be good at anything, I think is really
Mhm.
valuable. And I named this as a skill, not as a, thing that you just have, because it
It's
can be developed.
it's a learned skill. I don't think you don't like born with it. You're not aware of it, but you learn it over time. How about like
Yeah.
resiliency? Because I feel like you gotta be a little into pain. You gotta be willing to get punched in the mouth a couple times, and just you gotta be willing to keep going. And maybe that is we fold that into bravery, but I think that's a big part of it too. Like it's not going perfect most of the
Oh,
time. It's not
100%.
going perfect. It's not linear. Like you got to keep going and
You
with
got to keep
conviction.
going. Yeah. I
You
think,
got to keep going with conviction.
yeah, that's exactly right. I think absolutely it's a skill. It's interesting. I think of it as a byproduct of some of these other things, right? If you're brave and you have growth mindset, then you will naturally show up as resilient. And I think it is a muscle worth developing in the long term. There's this
Yep.
excellent investor called Alicia from a fund called Airtree. They're based in Australia, but they invest all over the world. And a friend of mine when she was sharing, we did an interview with her on our podcast, and when she was sharing her why we should interview her, she gave her probably the best compliment I can think of when I think about these skills. And she is essentially unbreakable. Like you cannot flap Alicia.
Mhm.
Just no matter what you put in front of her, no matter how hard the circumstance is, no matter how tricky the problem, she just steps up to the plate every time. And I think that has been really inspiring, especially for me when I think about, okay, the muscle on resiliency, the muscle on bravery, the muscle on growth mindset is the kind of target of being unflappable. That doesn't mean that you are disconnected from your emotions. That doesn't mean that you just turn the volume down on hardship. It doesn't mean that you pretend like nothing impacts you. Actually, I think those are really negative things to do. What you end up doing is losing an enormous amount of insight and signal. Right? It is the ability to absorb that and be anti-fragile and get better and grow as a result of those moments.
I love that.
And
Like
so that has been a practice I've been
strive to be
investing in
unbreakable.
recently.
I love that. That's my new life goal. Be unbreakable.
Isn't it beautiful? Yeah.
Uh-huh. It is beautiful. Okay. So with all that being said, and I know as an executive coach and as a founder and CEO of an executive coaching and advisory company. So like, what do you find to be like the value of executive coaching? Like for everybody listening, like why do it?
So my journey into it, I think, is helpful to paint the picture of why I still prioritize, well, built CoLab in the first place and then continue. The wonderful team at CoLab does an excellent job. I'm not as operational there anymore, but also continue to carve out time to coach wonderful folks like yourself. I only do a handful of them these days, but still absolutely love it. And the reason that I do that is because my journey, my first executive coach changed my life. And the reason that she changed my life was she caught me in a particular moment when I was on one of those growth curves, but I didn't have a lot of these skills, right? Up until that point, had been lucky enough that I had done pretty well at school. I was operating my first startup. I'd built a couple of companies when I was in Australia, but this was my first startup, venture-backed startup, operating in a high growth environment
Mhm.
in the US. And so it was way over my head in all kinds of different directions. I cannot name to you all of the places that I was on a growth curve. And I didn't really have a deep understanding of the growth mindset. Up until that point in my life, it was very much, right, you had to be excellent at what you did in everything that you did. You had to strive hard. Perfection was the only option, right? In law, that's a norm that is really fostered for you. I didn't have great interpersonal dynamic skills. My leadership skills heavily were coached by the professional environment I had grown up in. And so she caught me in a moment where she showed me that my learning curve was ultimately the driver of the value I could deliver through my organization. Mm. And me as a leverage point in the overall organization was the rate limiting step of the overall success of that company. And so if I wasn't growing very fast, neither was the company. Neither were the people in that company. Neither was the impact I was having in that company. And that, obviously, moment.
Right. Oh, that kind of makes sense in hindsight.
Right. Was so helpful. And then as an added bonus, it changed a period that actually felt really brittle, like I was just about to break for me, into a period of one of the most generative, fun learning environments of my career to date. And because I had such an incredible journey, you can imagine I was just telling all of my founder friends, oh, you have to get an executive coach. You have to get an executive coach. You have to. And it became obvious to me, actually, that's really hard to find a really high quality executive coach. And so what I was noticing is a lot of folks were making that effort to find a great executive coach, but the discovery problem is really hard. And so they were working with an executive coach, having a very different experience than what I had, and then putting it down overall. And that's even worse to me because they're like at the edge of the water to drink, couldn't access, and then are just not going anywhere near that pond again. And so when I think of the kind of sole reason to invest in your own development via a coach, via mentors, via self-training, whatever it is, right? It is as an accelerant for your overall organization. And this, thankfully, is no longer a radical perspective, right? There have been many generations now, especially in the Bay, of founders who've partnered with executive coaches to help them on that development journey, to help them accelerate up that journey. Mm-hmm. Google, Andreessen, Horowitz, all of them have had an executive coach or many executive coaches to help them accelerate. I just think it's like an open secret that is slowly making its way outside of those halls and is becoming normalized across the country and across the world. I also think the other element to pull out here is that building a company or building a project can be really lonely. There are only a handful of places that it is appropriate and valuable for you to share, deeply share the buckets that you need support on. And very often there's nowhere where you can share the full amount of it, right? Your life partner, if you are lucky enough to have one, deeply cares about you, loves you, but might not have the context of your business or might not have the professional experience to be able to be that thought partner with you. Your co-founder, very often is the source of some of the frustrations. And so having a forum to talk to outside of that can be really valuable because you can't necessarily productively bring it into that conversation. It's not appropriate for you to bring all that information downwards into your team. And it is also not appropriate and often disadvantageous for you to bring it upwards if you happen to have a board or a community of advisors or those kinds of things. So what that leaves a lot of founders with is carrying the bag 100% by themselves. And you and I both know the kind of mental health ecosystem in the founder population is pretty bad. And so the kind of last bucket there is I find it really valuable as a really productive place to do excellent work, hone your skills, develop yourself, and also get some of that partnership that can be really valuable when you're in some of these really rapid growth periods of your life and shortcut you on some of those things.
Sounds like a mic drop moment. I feel like that was perfect. As you're talking and I'm listening, I'm going all the way back. The concept of carrying a founder backpack and throwing rocks and boulders into it because you're just constantly taking it, you're absorbing it. You don't have anything, you don't have any way to empty the bag. That's a real thing. So for me, I've always been ambitious. I had this love-hate relationship with accounting and finance. Like I went into it and then I was like frustrated that I went into it because I feel like I'm not doing the right thing. And then I just committed myself to literally starting a movement to change the whole thing. And because I was so ambitious, that meant that I wasn't just trying to live a lifestyle business. I was trying to do something really aspirational that I'd never done before, like first time founder. And we started getting to a point, and I'll never forget this. We had like our first offsite, and we were starting to get like big. We were doing like a couple $1,000,000 worth of revenue. We had, probably 20 people. And I never sat down and thought about the fact that maybe I see the world a little bit different than everybody else. Like maybe I'm going to have to be the driving force that kind of leads everybody forward. I'm going to have to take the first step. And we ran an offsite. And I just remember, and the offsite was probably pretty shitty, to be honest, because it was based off Gino Wickman's book Traction. And it was like a full day and it was way too long. But the feedback I got from the team was like, man, that was like incredible. That was so helpful. I just loved hearing about where we're going and how we're going to build a business. And that just forced me to commit myself to being better, because if I didn't do it, nobody was going to do it. And I remember our first interaction, and I'd never been coached, right? So, and you come up in professional services, and most of the people, I'm sure some folks are lucky to find great mentors in that world, but I think it's a little archaic in terms of you don't talk about that stuff. Like you just put your head down, you grind it out. You don't talk about the hard stuff, the feelings, any of that stuff. And I think that's like really toxic, to be honest. I mean, it's not helpful. Like you got to do something productive with all those things you experience and feel. So what you described, like having a place to go to just let that out and start to hear that you're not the only one, dude. There's other people that are going through the same stuff, building companies. Like it's almost like rinse and repeat. Everybody's going through their own version of the same stuff. And having a safe place to go talk about that stuff and unpack it takes time. First of all, like that is like the first, I don't know, it depends on who you are and how much baggage you got, but that's 6 months plus. And then you start to think about, you got me to start to think about how do I scale and create leverage for myself and for the business. And it had me thinking about it all very differently. And I think it's because I was able to just purge all of it, just very like object with a clear mind. Okay, like here's our objectives. Here's what we want to do. Help me think about some frameworks. These are the problems I'm solving. Like your ability to bring some frameworks to help me apply to some of the challenges I was facing. Like you never tell me like what to do, and I'm not asking you what to do, but being able to workshop some of that stuff and practice skills, it was very beneficial to me. And it was like steroids for business. It just helped accelerate my journey to CEO and helped build a lot of confidence for me. And the nature of the work we did, like it was more than just coaching. You also were advising us as a company, and the connections and the people that I made because of that decision to be coached, I think changed the entire trajectory of my career in the business. And, I look back on it, it's probably like the best decision that I've made was to accept coaching and pursue coaching. And I don't think without that decision, like we would have gone from, Syracuse-based company to scaling high growth, emerging industry leader with like very sophisticated, awesome capital partner from Silicon Valley. Like we're just going to set the world on fire. And I don't think that all of those things happen if I had not pursued that decision. Was that?
Yeah. I mean, that is very powerful to hear. I mean, I think it, as I said at the top of the call, I think it appreciates your role in that work. I'm very confident you would have built and could be building a company that's setting the world on fire without that partnership. But I think it really highlights, it is an accelerant, can be an accelerant for you if used appropriately. I reflect on my own journey with coaching, right? I've had a coach since I had my first ever coach. And I do an annual reflection on my year every year. And pretty much every year, at least 5 to 7 of my 10 key takeaways and things that I'm going to keep doing the following year come from work with my coach. Because it's so hard when you're like in it and operating to find enough of a vantage point to pull out and ask yourself some of these questions. And it's so easy to have your blinkers on and not have someone else push in from the side and be like, hey, what about this thing over here you haven't considered? And be like,
committing the time to, that's my space to do that. I just think most people, if they haven't committed themselves to that type of experience, like you don't have the time in your day, and you probably haven't put it on your calendar. And you need someone to help facilitate that for you too.
100%. Yeah. I think it's so easy without that partnership to not allocate that time and therefore not do that work and get stuck in the kind of doing as opposed to the leading. It's so important to get that leverage to pull out and start leading as opposed to just doing. And so I think it's a really valuable thing to do.
Yeah. We'll keep doing the work you're doing. And I'm going to put you on the spot a little bit. I'm going to say, if you had to pick one thing that stands out to you, if you think about Matt 1.0 from 3 years ago when we first met, and you think about everything you've seen over the last 3 years and where we're at today, and we still got a long way to go. But is there anything in particular stands out to you as an area of progress that has been noticeable or that you have seen? And that's the thing you point to, yeah, I feel like that's the difference I made.
Oof, such a good
It could be
question.
more than one, but you don't have to do more than one.
Well, I'll tell you the ones that pop to mind, my initial instinct. My first one is, right from the day that we met, I was really impressed by your structured thinking, right? It's clear that you were capable of breaking down a system, working out what the right leverage points were at that system, kind of building processes to effectively manage and lead your team, and really excellent at developing a really great vision. And I think, which is pretty normal for most folks coming up in professional services and or of our era, there's a kind of healthy skepticism through to apprehension when it comes to anything to do with emotions. And so emotions as a data feed was left to the side, treated with skepticism, didn't see the relevance or value for them. One growth trajectory I have seen you do over that period of time is to both understand, deeply understand the data you're getting from your emotions, and then be able to strategically use it on the way that you lead your team, on the way that you set your vision, and the way that you influence others, on the way that you might navigate certain circumstances, right? I think that has been incredible to watch. And I think, to really make the point here, we're talking about the ability to say, I actually have an instinct on this, and this is my instinct, and this is where it's coming from. It's being informed partly by this thing over here and partly informed by this thing over here. And now I feel like I can really trust that instinct and chase that instinct. Instinct-made decisions can be really valuable. It is the fastest way for us to make high-quality decisions if it's high quality. And so I think that's one kind of growth trajectory I've definitely seen. Another growth trajectory I feel like I've watched over that period of time, which has a bunch of component parts, but I think is really valuable, is as humans, it can be really hard to adjust our conceptualization of our circumstance in line with the opportunity that we're facing. It's generally like a trailing indicator, So we can, and you'll see this often with founders that are going through rapid growth, is, for example, when they become the CEO of a 300-person company and they have a public profile and people, kind of a net new employee that joins the organization, sees them as the CEO, that doesn't align to their self-identity. They just think of themselves as a founder, friends with everyone, have no conceptualization of the hierarchy that they're understood to have. And when not effectively appreciated, it actually can cause quite a lot of challenges, right? It can cause things like not really understanding the impact you are having when you're giving throwaway comments in a meeting, and not really understanding the degree to which people are looking to you to make decisions, those kinds of things. And so I think you've done an excellent job of kind of catching up your thinking to the current opportunity set that you're currently in. And I think that's really accelerated the growth of Hiline as a business, but also the growth of your career. And that took, putting down some imposter syndrome, putting down some of those kind of self-beliefs that were about your confidence and your capacity, giving yourself permission to test some of those boundaries that you believed existed that turned out not to exist, and rapidly learning from that and then compounding on that as you went. There's a whole bunch of tactical stuff, right? Of just understanding the operations of your business to a greater degree, understanding how to constantly level up your expectations on the team that you have, develop them on that journey, set a high bar for them, all of those things. But to me, if I think about the kind of really high leverage skills, those are the two that really pop to mind.
Yeah, that was awesome. That was like getting your report card read out loud to you. So thank you for sharing that. That was cool. So Maxine, this has been awesome and such a pleasure to have you be my first guest and help me work out the kinks as we get the podcast up and running. Before we go, I'd love to just plug CoVentures in what you're doing and have you talk about that for a minute, because I think it's so cool what you've done. Maxine heads Australia's first venture fund led by a solo female GP, and it's the country's first dedicated pre-seed fund, which I think that is such a cool thing and such a big deal. And you just closed out officially your first fund not that long ago. And I'm also like super grateful to be participating in very small ways in LP. So just, whatever you want to do to plug kind of the bit, what you guys are up to, the types of companies you back. I'm sure everybody would like to hear a little bit about it.
Yeah, thank you so much for the layup. So, I think you have set it up really well. We just invest in pre-seed, so we don't invest in seed. We don't invest in Series A, which is a fairly unusual model, right? Generally, venture funds seek to invest multi-stage. We seek to invest our full firepower with the founders that we back at the very earliest stage alongside them. We invest in companies anywhere in the world, but we need at least one Australian founder. And we're looking to accelerate and be the bridge into the US and specifically into the Bay Area. And so really looking to back companies that are building software companies that can make a really big dent in the world. And so if that happens to align to anyone that's listening, we would absolutely love to hear from you. Just hit me up on LinkedIn, and maybe you can pop a link to my LinkedIn in the show notes. And yeah, just hit me up. We would absolutely love to chat to you.
Yeah, hit Maxine up. Maxine, keep doing all the awesome work that you're doing. Thanks for joining today, and I'll see you at your next coaching session.
Thanks so much for having me on.